Picture walking through a mist-covered forest, where the air hums with the whispers of forgotten voices, and roots twist like the veins of the earth itself. Imagine the scent of damp moss rising with every step, the crunch of brittle leaves underfoot mingling with the distant drip of unseen water. In these shadowed depths, long before recorded history, there lived a civilization so cunning, so deeply entwined with the soil and stone, that they became part of the very earth itself. These were the Root Folk, a lost underground civilization whose stories tunneled beneath the surface of myth and reality. For centuries, they endured a war unlike any other, a conflict stretching 500 years beneath the roots of our world, shaping not only the subterranean labyrinths but the fate of the surface dwellers above. But who were these Root Folk really? What secrets lie buried under layers of soil and myth, and why did their world, once alive and thriving, vanish beneath the weight of time and silence? This should be no surprise to anyone who's ever been enchanted by the idea of hidden societies tucked away from the eyes of the world. Mysterious people living out their lives within the dark embrace of the earth, guarding ancient knowledge and locked in endless struggle. Folklorists have long wondered about their origins and purposes, whispering theories through decades of dusty manuscripts and folklore collections. Some say they were the protectors of the old forests. Others claim they were the original environmental activists, tuning their lives inseparably with the rhythms of root and fungus, soil and leaf. These Root Folk were more than mere creatures of legend. They represented a delicate balance, a symbiosis with the living earth that, in many ways, we still fail to grasp. This might be the strangest thing about the Root Folk. They weren't giants or dwarfs, nor shadowy spirits or monsters as one might expect from underground myths. They were small, fragile in appearance, often no taller than a child, with skin that seemed to shimmer like bark and hair tangled with leaves and twigs. Their eyes, luminous and deep-set, betrayed a wisdom that outlived centuries, yet their voices were soft, almost musical, blending into the natural sounds of the forest floor. Far from violent, savage dwellers, they lived as caregivers and keepers of root networks, tending to the underground veins that sustained not only their homes but the very life force of the lands above. Yet there is irony laced deep within their story. A civilization so intimately connected to growth found itself mired in a war that nearly destroyed the roots of their world. In 14th century England, chroniclers like John Aubrey hinted at strange folk spotted near ancient oak groves and cavernous hollow hills, calling them the little green men of the deep earth. Across Europe, similar tales appear, tales collected by folklorists such as Catherine Briggs and varied accounts in Grimm's fairy tales, where tiny woodland beings convene beneath the soil, wielding curious root-like weapons and wearing armor made of compacted earth. But these were never mere fairy-tale sprites. Legend holds that the Root Folk were organized into clans, each responsible for safeguarding different parts of the underworld, some overseeing fungal mycelium that linked trees across miles, others tending subterranean springs and mineral veins. Their war, a prolonged struggle against a rival subterranean species known only as the Stoneborn, pit earth against stone in an epic hidden conflict that lasts half a millennium. To grasp the scale of this war, imagine a medieval social worker's grim task multiplied across generations, devoted to maintaining fragile alliances and preventing the fall of fragile ecosystems from below. The war was less about conquest and more about survival, protecting the underground networks that sustain surface forests from destruction by malicious forces or environmental imbalance. Just like nature's version of security cameras, the Root Folk were vigilant chroniclers of threats that humans could neither see nor understand. They were the Earth's hidden stewards, who communicated through delicate vibrations and chemical signals, messages carried from root to root like an ancient internet beneath our feet. The stories tell us something else, though, about the toll such eternal vigilance takes. In Czech folklore from the 16th century, a tale survives of a young Root Folk warrior named Brannock, whose voice was said to echo faintly through the tunnels long after his death. He confided in a human maiden, promising that peace could be achieved only if the surface dwellers ceased their relentless deforestation. Sadly, his warnings fell on deaf ears, and the war raged on. The Root Folk's plight mirrored a growing anxiety, a reflection of humanity's growing disconnect from the natural world, and a foreshadowing of environmental collapse. In that sense, The root folk serve as echoes of ancient therapy sessions, weaving lessons on symbiosis, respect, and the consequences of ignorance. But the root folk war was more than just an environmental dispute. Beneath the surface lay a deep spiritual schism. The root folk believed that every root contained a soul, a piece of the collective memory of the land's ancient past. In their culture, a root struck down was a story erased. A plant uprooted was a song silenced. This belief anchored their fierce resistance against the Stoneborn, who were said to be the embodiment of cold, unyielding rock, bent on severing living connections and turning life into lifeless monuments. This idea was captured vividly in a Welsh folktale documented by folklorist Wirt Sykes during the 19th century, telling of a heroic root folk elder named Selyn who sacrificed himself to bind the growing Stoneborn fortress, using his own body as living root thread. The imagery is haunting. Imagine the sound of stone grinding against earth, while a single, soft, persistent voice rises beneath it, a desperate song of protection, sacrifice, and resistance. Culturally, the root folk occupy a liminal space between life and death, nature and spirit, a threshold that ancient peoples instinctively guarded against crossing without reverence. Their underground world was not merely physical but profoundly symbolic, a metaphor for memory, lineage, and ancestral connection. Medieval European peasants, often illiterate but rich in oral tradition, considered tales of root folk as cautionary reminders keeping their community in balance. In 12th century Wales, bards sang of these beings not as mere fables but as emissaries of the old world, linking the past to the present like a fragile but precious thread. They were the original environmental activists, not wielding placards or petitions but living embodiments of harmony and stewardship. Yet beneath this behavior lay a story of loss. Why did belief in the root folk fade? Scholars like Marina Warner suggest it was part of a broader disenchantment, a slow drift when industrialization and urban expansion pushed humanity's gaze ever upward and outward, leaving the subterranean life, the hidden magic of the earth, to obscurity. With the rise of Enlightenment reason and scientific materialism, the soulful trickle of these folk tales ran dry, replaced by skepticism and cold categorization. We lost something precious, an intimate relationship with the soil and mystery, a guardian race that reminded us that beneath our feet lies not just dirt but a living world of stories and spirits. The modern parallels are striking. Today, while the root folk themselves may have vanished into legend, their function lives on. Environmental movements, conservationists, even indigenous land protectors serve as heirs to their cause, like echoes in a vast cavern, calling us to remember that the roots of life run deep. We have substituted their soft voices with data, the hum of satellites and sensors acting as our nature's version of security cameras. But unlike the root folk, who embodied connection, beyond the visible, our technology often blinds us to the subtle webs of life beneath the ground. The loss of the root folk is a metaphor for a wider loss, the fading of mystery in a world desperate for wonder. But the story of the root folk is far from finished. As we descend further into history, seeking answers from petroglyphs in southern France and ancient cave paintings in the Carpathian Mountains, more fragments emerge, fragments of a civilization that challenged the very definition of life and war, coexistence and destruction. Near the site of an abandoned mining village in Lithuania, researchers unearthed relics, a small pendant entwined with carved root motifs, believed to belong to a root folk shaman. This find suggests that their influence crossed boundaries and cultures, a subterranean thread weaving through human history. What these tales really reveal is a narrative not simply about mythical creatures below the earth, but a mirror held up to ourselves. A civilization of delicate caregivers locked in an eternal struggle with forces that seek to sever the living bonds we all share. They remind us that war and peace are not only battles for kingdoms above, but contests for the very soul of nature beneath. And as the echo of their saga fades, we are left to wonder, will we heed their ancient warnings or continue the legacy that silenced the root folk forever? The roots of this story dig deeper still, beneath layers of dust and time, waiting for those who dare to listen closely enough to hear the faint, musical hum of an underground world still whispering in the dark. And soon we will delve even further, into the heart of their civilization, the magic of their culture, and the final chapters of their 500-year war that shaped not only their fate, but perhaps ours as well. But the saga of the Root Folk was far from a simple battle beneath the earth. It was a complex tapestry of alliances, betrayals, sacrifice, and an ongoing attempt to preserve a delicate balance long before humanity understood what was at stake. Imagine the sprawling darkness of their underground cities, a labyrinth carved from roots and rock, bathed in the faint iridescence of bioluminescent fungi that cast ghostly shadows on walls mapped like the veins of leaves. Within these winding halls, the Root Folk lived, breathed, and governed, a society that valued memory and connection above all else. For in their worldview, every living root was a thread woven into the ever-growing tapestry of the Earth's soul. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Root Folk was their language, a nuanced symphony of vibrations and chemical signals transmitted through the roots they tended and the soil they nurtured. Unlike spoken words that rise and fall like a river's rush, their conversations were slow, deliberate, felt more than heard, as if the earth itself whispered secrets only they could understand. This method of communication was a double-edged sword. It allowed rapid, silent, and widespread warning across vast underground networks, but it also bound their society tightly to the health of their environment. When a root wilted or a spring dried, whole communities felt the loss as a grievous wound, their conversations turning fragile, akin to a chorus faltering in a storm. It was in this context that the 500-year war with the Stoneborn unfolded, not a war of weapons and armies, but a prolonged contest of survival and endurance. The Stoneborn themselves were creatures both feared and misunderstood. Legends describe them as beings emerging from the hardest bedrock of the earth, carved from granite and quartz, their skin rough like cracked stone and their eyes cold and unyielding like obsidian. Unlike the Root Folk, who saw the earth as a living, breathing organism, the Stoneborn viewed it as a fortress to be hardened and controlled. They sought to cement their dominion by turning fertile soil into lifeless stone, chipping away at the networks of roots that sustained both underground and surface worlds. The myths tell of a battle not fought with swords or spears, but through the very elements, the roots against the stone. In one chilling Welsh folktale documented by Wirt Sykes, an ancient Root Folk elder named Selyn sacrificed himself by intertwining his own living form within the growing Stoneborn fortress, binding roots deep into the cracks of granite to halt its expansion. According to the tale, as his body fused with the stone, his voice sang a haunting melody, soft and persistent, rising beneath the grinding cold, a lament for the earth and a prayer for renewal. Imagine the weight of stone pressing down, the scent of damp moss mixing with the cold sharpness of mineral dust, while beneath it all a quiet song drifts, resilient, persistent, mournful. But there were darker chapters too. In 16th century Bohemian lore, scholars unearthed tales of corruption and tragedy within Root Folk society itself. One story follows Brannock, a young warrior whose promise of peace to a human maiden was betrayed by the unyielding greed of surface rulers who refused to halt deforestation. His voice was said to echo through the tunnels even centuries later, a ghostly warning that slipped between roots and stones, a lament for coexistence lost to human folly. The tale reveals not only the Root Folk's connection to humans, but also the tragic inevitability that sometimes, despite the best intentions, wisdom goes unheard. The 500 years of conflict thus became a slow undoing not only of underground life, but also of the bonds linking underground and surface worlds. This struggle between Root Folk and Stoneborn reveals something deeper about the worldview of medieval Europeans, one anchored in a spiritual ecology where life was interconnected, fragile, and sacred. In the oldie world, every root carried a soul, every stone a story, and interrupting that flow was tantamount to severing life itself. It explains why the Root Folk were less conquerors and more guardians, embodying a principle that modern environmentalism echoes, that to care for the earth beneath our feet is to care for ourselves. This belief inspired rituals and customs widely varied across regions. In 12th century Wales, bards sang songs of the Root Folk not as fables but as sacred memory, while in Germanic lands, chroniclers like the Brothers Grimm preserved stories of small figures weaving roots into talismans of protection, tiny guardians of balance and harmony. Yet beneath this bond lay a shadow, the slow fading of belief as modernity dawned. With the rise of Enlightenment science and industrial expansion, stories of root folk were dismissed as superstition. The forests receded, mines expanded, and cities rose, severing the subterranean bonds these beings symbolized. This loss was not merely of myth, but of a profound relationship with the land. Scholars like Marina Warner argue that this mirrored disenchantment left humanity less connected, more alienated from the cycles of life beneath the soil. We replace the root folk's delicate, living communication with technology, the hum of satellites, the beeping sensors monitoring deforestation rates. But these tools often miss the nuance and depth of true connection. The loss of the root folk is a symbolic lament for the loss of mystery, of wonder, and of reverence for the unseen. In a curious modern parallel, indigenous land guardians across the world echo the root folk's role, protectors of sacred sites, keepers of ancient knowledge, and stewards of the invisible webs that tie forest to soil and spirit. They act like nature's version of security cameras, vigilant and deeply knowledgeable, watching over the subtle shifts in ecosystems that science is only just beginning to understand. It's as if the root folk's legacy persists, transformed and hidden, urging us to remember that stewardship cannot be imposed from above, but must arise from intimate knowledge and respect. Excavations in Eastern Europe continue to hint at the extent of the root folk's influence. Near ancient Slavic settlements, archaeologists discovered small carved pendants with root motifs, believed to belong to shamans who navigated both the spiritual and the physical realms underground. These artifacts, dated to the 15th century, suggest that the root folk were not isolated, but interacted with human societies in complex ways, sharing knowledge, trade, and perhaps warnings. This interweaving of cultures challenges us to reconsider how we define civilization itself, not only as the cities and empires above ground, but as interconnected communities spanning visible and hidden worlds. As we reflect on the root folk's story, a melancholy yet vital truth emerges. They were the original environmental activists, embodying a sacred duty to nurture and protect life's root systems long before such ideas became fashionable. Their 500-year war was not the violent clash of armies, but a relentless struggle to preserve the story of the earth, its memories, and its future. The root folk remind us that peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the active cultivation of balance. For every root cut is a wound, every stone hardened a loss. And so, what became of them? As the surface world consumed more of the forests and land, the root folk's domains shrank until they vanished into myth and memory. Their final farewell is whispered in the rustling leaves, in the traced lines of fungi and lichen, in the humming vibrancy of untouched soil. They became silent under the weight of time, a subterranean chorus slowly fading, leaving us to inherit not only their losses but their lessons. But the roots of their story survive in more than just tales. They live in our forests, in the intricate networks of trees quietly communicating beneath the ground, and in the wisdom of those who still respect the hidden life of the earth. They beckon us to pause, to listen to the faint, musical hum beneath our feet, and to remember that beneath the soil lies not mere dirt, but a world alive with stories, spirits, and ancient guardians. The root folk's saga is an invitation, one to reconnect with wonder, to honor the unseen, and to recognize that the war for the soul of the earth is ongoing. Their story urges us to become caregivers once more, to tend the roots of life with patience and reverence. For in doing so, we not only preserve the memory of a lost civilization, but rekindle a sacred bond that sustains us all. As you step away from this tale, I invite you to wonder about the roots beneath your own feet, the silent world so easily overlooked. What stories does your earth hold? What voices whisper in the darkness just beyond sight? And how might we, today, honor the legacy of the root folk by protecting and cherishing the delicate threads of life that bind us beneath the surface? Because ultimately, to remember the root folk is to remember that we were once, and perhaps still can be, part of something greater, an ancient chorus of life singing softly beneath the marching noise of human progress. Their lost civilization is more than a memory. It is a call to awaken, to listen, and to tend the roots that connect us to the old soul of the earth itself.